All right, greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Caracal here, or Adams van Zyl. And tonight we're talking about a topic that is very relevant to our times in terms of something that people are talking about increasingly on social media. And it's also a topic that's a bit disturbing. It's something that's concerning. It's not an uplifting topic, but it is something that is very important that needs to be addressed. And AfriForum is one of the role players that are addressing the issue and bringing awareness to it. And therefore, tonight I'm talking to Ernst Roets of AfriForum, to the author of Kill the Boer, a book on farm murders, and he's going to enlighten us a bit more about the latest revelations in regards to this scourge, and also in terms of the trends we've been seeing in 2020. Welcome to the show, Ernst.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here, and it's good to be able to talk about this topic.
Right. So yesterday, AfriForum had a media conference on specifically farm murders. Something that AfriForum regularly does is publishing the latest data and giving some insight into the trends. But you also released a documentary during this press conference. But before we get to the documentary, what was the main focus of this press conference and this release of information by AfriForum yesterday?
Yes, so the press conference was, of course, in response to the recent spike in farm attacks and farm murders that we saw after the in the last month or so. And also the fact that something that we pointed out or emphasized during the conference was that during this lockdown, the president used one of his speeches about the lockdown and the state of the corona crisis as an opportunity to talk about violence against women in South Africa. Now, that's something that should not necessarily be a problem, and it's something that, to be even in all fairness, it's something that we think should be welcomed. The fact that the president has said that he has identified a particular problem in South Africa and that this problem needs to be addressed. And he spoke with great compassion about the victims. He mentioned some of their names. He told their stories. And he elaborated on what the South African government is doing about this. And he spoke about the government spending a lot of money just in this one financial year. He spoke about resources being allocated to address the problem. He even went as far as saying that we should, in order to really solve or address this problem, we need to ask ourselves the difficult questions, and people should really take a moment to consider the consequences of their silence. Of course, all with regard to violence against women. And what we said is, and we wrote a letter to the president, which we submitted. What we said in the letter is that we welcome this. It's good for the president to take a stance against violence against women because it is a problem in South Africa. And that is why what we are saying with regard to farm murders is we want equal treatment for farmers. We don't want special treatment, we want equal treatment. And what that means is well, firstly, it's ironic that the president said with regard to violence against women that people should consider the consequences of their silence. And when we talk about farm murders, one of the major problems is the silence by the South African government, but in particular, the state president. So in terms of wanting equal treatment, what we are saying is that here is a particular problem in society, and it is a problem that should be recognized, and there should be a counter strategy to solve this or to fix this and to prevent these attacks from happening. And in that sense, it's asking for equal treatment, not special treatment, because there are many such examples in South Africa, whether it be violence against women, which is the most recent example, or cash in transit heists, or gang-related violence, or copper cable theft, or rhino poaching. There's a list of examples where government has responded with appropriate or a particular reaction that is tailored towards the problem. But all of a sudden, when we talk about farm murders, then all of a sudden the response is that we should be talking about all murders. And part of the irony that I pointed out in an opinion piece recently is that people who are quick to say Black Lives Matter are also quick to say that all crime should be regarded as equal, or you shouldn't point to a particular crime phenomenon such as farm murders, because you should rather respond to all crimes at the same time. And obviously there's a very glaring and obviously glaring double standard in that approach.
And you would expect from any reasonable society where people are concerned about these types of issues that this would be a non-controversial issue to be saying maybe we should put more focus on this phenomenon and the scourge that we're seeing. And looking at the stats, looking at the stories, I mean, it's not something that you can easily deny. It's something that you only can deny if you really do some mental gymnastics. And I think that's the concerning thing, is that we're seeing a lot of people not only saying that it's not as severe, but saying that it doesn't even happen. I mean, and it's not like it's just a random person on social media saying that it's not happening. I mean, I can quote the president of South Africa directly by saying that there is no murdering of white farmers in South Africa, direct quote. So this is what's so disturbing about it. But something that I wanted to ask as well is, when we see all these types of conspiracy theories and people saying that it's not real, or that it's it's just farmers being killed by their own family members. This is a popular conspiracy theory as well, seeing as there was 1 or 2 cases of this happening. But why is it so popular for regular people on social media to so easily deny this? I mean, you can't truly have this conclusion that the majority of people are just conscienceless, morally bankrupt individuals. There must be something that gives them their certainty that this is that this phenomenon is not as serious as it is.
Yes, it's a strange thing, and it's something that Theo de Jager pointed out from SAI, that one of the major differences between farm attacks or farm murders and other crime phenomena is the sentiment regarding these attacks by politicians and people on social media. You don't find politicians singing about murdering women. We had a year or so ago, a member of parliament made a discriminatory or an offensive comment towards women, and he had to face the consequences for that. His career was basically ruined because of his discriminatory remarks regarding women. But when we're talking about farmers, it's not simply making discriminatory remarks is not, that's not the problem. The problem is politicians singing about murdering these people, and people on social media calling for these people to be murdered. We don't have a problem in South Africa with people going on Twitter and saying, let's poach rhinos and take their horns, and let's sell the rhino horns illegally. And we don't have a problem with people saying that women must be beaten and assaulted and so forth. And we don't have a problem with people encouraging copper cable theft or encouraging gang-related violence.
Or the opposite of Black Lives Matter being people saying that no, police brutality is good.
Yes, exactly. So you don't find that, but when you talk about farm murders, you do find it, and you find it regularly, and people see it, and then we have a situation with members of the ruling party and some opposition parties who are sort of in the same ideological camp, who sing songs, to use an example, about murdering farmers, or who make comments about. I remember Julius Malema once saying, someone said to him, people are saying that you are behind farm murders, and then he responded and he said, maybe I am, maybe I'm not, or something like that. So we have these type of comments, and then we have people actually being murdered. And so you need to own up to that. So that just says a lot about the Overton window in South Africa, where, there's the Black Lives Matters, sentiment and all of that. But also, I don't see people going on social media talking about how we need to exterminate black people and that type of thing. It's only with regard to farmers that you see this, or white people in general, but you could say white people in general, but farmers in particular. So yes, there's a particular zeitgeist in South Africa on this issue, and the question is, how did we get here? And I think we mustn't try to oversimplify the reason on why we got here. I think one of the reasons is, it's the very politically incorrect thing to say, but I think one of the reasons is cultural, in terms of the culture that the ANC has to an extent created or succeeded in creating among its support base. Or perhaps, I think, to put it even more accurately, in my view, the culture that the ANC has destroyed. In other words, the healthy culture that to an extent has been destroyed, where we now have a culture of violence in South Africa. So that's one side of it, and I think another side of it is politics. The ruling party has a very clear political ideological agenda, and they are pushing this narrative as far as they can, and it's a narrative in which they are regarded as the only victims, and others are regarded as the only perpetrators. And it's a narrative that they are pushing quite aggressively, and unfortunately, many in the mainstream, many academics and commentators and so forth are buying into this narrative and advocating the same narrative. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we have this situation on South Africa's farms.
Mm. And it is interesting to see that the people that, for example, say some very horrific things on social media. For example, one of the responses I saw when Ian Cameron tweeted out that story of that pregnant woman whose throat was slit was that this one woman said, oh, more fake news, or this is just another lie. But I think what's happening here is I don't think these people are genuinely like thinking to themselves, I want to be just the most evil person in the world. They are genuinely under the impression that people are just lying about it and that they are fighting the good fight against disinformation. But this is definitely something that has harmed the cause to bring awareness to farm murders, is the fact that people are under this impression. But and then you see this hypocrisy when it comes to other issues, like, for example, Black Lives Matter. But you mentioned earlier that you wrote that opinion piece about you contrasted the farm murder campaign to bring awareness to farm murders with this more mainstream Black Lives Matter phenomenon, or this movement. Could you maybe give a brief summary of what your main argument with that opinion piece was?
Yes. So the opinion piece is about, because I saw a lot of people on social media talking about these two issues, about Black Lives Matter, because obviously it's a big issue at the moment, and then together with that, farm attacks. And one response to Black Lives Matter that I believe is not not the appropriate response is the response to simply say that you cannot say Black Lives Matter, you can only say all lives matter. I think the more appropriate response would be to say that you can point, there's nothing wrong with pointing to a particular crime phenomenon and saying that this is a particular problem and this problem has to be fixed. And if that is the case, that Black people are being targeted disproportionately, not only is there nothing wrong with it, it's a good thing that this is pointed out and that people respond to this. But so the question is rather, are we dealing with something that truly is a unique problem in terms of people who are being targeted disproportionately or based on their identity? And if that is the case, then there's nothing wrong with having a Black Lives Matter campaign. And I think the same goes for farm murders. There's nothing wrong with pointing to a particular crime phenomenon, because it would be inconsistent to say stop farm murders, but then also to say your response to Black Lives Matters is all lives matter. And the same way, I don't see that as much as I see it the other way around, where you would have people, tweet hashtag Black Lives Matter. They would change their profile pictures to Black Lives Matter and all of that. But then if someone talks about farm murders, their response would be, no, crime is crime. You should talk about all crime. I see that a lot. And the tragedy about this whole thing is when I say I see that a lot, I'm talking about editors of newspapers and professors and political analysts doing that, not uninformed people on Twitter or people with 10 followers. So that's, I think, the point here is you can have a Black Lives Matter campaign, but your challenge then is that you would have to point out that the issue that you are campaigning for is actually something that is a significant problem. In other words, you have to point out that if that's the issue, that Black people are in fact disproportionately being targeted because of the fact that they are Black, and they are being targeted by the police. If that's your case, you need to be able to point that out, that the police are in fact targeting people because of the color of their skin and not because of other factors. And we could talk about that. So I went into that a bit in the article. We can elaborate on that if you want. But the point is that it's the same with farm murders. If you want to talk about farm murders being a problem, you need to be able to point out why you are saying that it is a problem. And you don't need to, it's not necessary for you to point out that farm murders is the worst crime phenomenon in the world. There's no there is no community that is being attacked or murdered at the same ratio as commercial farmers, or that there's no crime in the world that is as brutal as farm murders. You don't need to prove that, although you could to an extent make that argument. What you need to prove is that this is a particular problem. It has particular consequences, and it's something that is worth campaigning against. We can talk about the statistics. You run into muddy waters if you try to calculate the per 100,000 ratio at which farmers are being targeted for a variety of reasons. But it's something that we should at least try to do, because if we do so, we can strengthen our arguments.
And something I find very interesting is the fact that if you, for example, contrast the Black Lives Matter movement with the movement to bring awareness to farm murders, there's two things stand out to me. Firstly, the movement to bring awareness to farm murders is not labeled White Lives Matter. That's not the hashtag. The whole movement about farm murders and bringing awareness to it is around the farming community and helping our rural community that is definitely at risk at the moment, disproportionately at risk, and being seen as soft targets. And you can see it now once we get into the trends that we've been seeing over the lockdown. But then the second trend, and I think you touched on this in your opinion piece, is that the one cause has immense mainstream backing in terms of corporations, the mainstream media, politicians. It's not going to risk your career or your social standing or your status or your reputation if you come out and say Black Lives Matter or this is a cause that I support. You'll actually be applauded for it. But on the other side, if you come out and you say, like, for example, now we see, and I don't think this has hit the news yet, but we're seeing there's now one of the South African cricket players said that they need to do like a Black Lives Matter campaign. And some of the other cricket players have said, but why don't we include farm murders as well, seeing as this is something that's really affecting our specific society. And there's like a big social media debate around it now already. But then what I find interesting there, and you're probably going to see it now in the coming days as this story becomes more mainstream, is that those people that are bringing awareness to farm murders and bringing that into the conversation are going to be ostracized and attacked and shamed and smeared. You're probably going to see some vile stuff being said about them in the mainstream, probably even from pretty mainstream pundits. But on the other side, you don't get it. You don't really see people that, for example, put up a Facebook status with Black Lives Matter being attacked by their friends on Facebook. But I've personally seen the opposite happen, where people that I know on Facebook say something about farm murders and their friends on Facebook say, this is not right of you to put this on your page. This is propaganda, or saying you shouldn't be spreading this information. All crime is equally important. And that's just very interesting, that type of contrast. I know you touched on it in your opinion piece, so you can get into that to kind of go off my point that I just made.
Well, no, I think what I want to emphasize is that farm murders is a very, and I'm sort of coming in with a bit of a segue here. I want to get to the point about the narrative, but maybe to explain that farm murders, or the whole phenomenon of farm attacks, is a multidimensional issue. So you will find people saying that farm murders are clearly racially motivated, and they will be able to prove it with examples. And then you will find people saying farm murders are clearly not racially motivated. It's clearly motivated simply by the intention to steal. And they will find examples to prove it. And they will be able to tell you that this person, this was his background, this is what happened, and as a result thereof, he had no other options, and that's why this happened. And so we find that, and then we find people saying that, I think the racial one or the political one is probably the most controversial one. Or to what extent is it just the result of inequality? We hear that a lot. People saying that it's because of inequality, that's why these attacks are happening, and then they will use some examples to prove that. Or I think another one that we hear frequently is farm attacks happen because the farmers abuse their farm workers. Right. And then they would pick up some example of a farmer that abused their farm worker, as if that is the norm or the trend. Or it
but just before you continue, Ernst, that's just very funny, because that reminds me of people that say, where when you hear about someone, a wife that's being beaten by her husband, those types of people that say, well, I've heard stories about her burning his food, so there must be something in there.
Yes, yeah, it's exactly. I think that's a good point. To why is he beating her? Maybe there's a good reason why he's beating his wife. That's that type of argument. And so what we have is people try to use this issue to promote particular narratives. So what I can say, it hasn't been published yet. Some of the viewers might have followed the discussion on Twitter. I had about an hour-long discussion with Prof. Adam Habib, the Vice Chancellor of Wits, after a series of tweets he made about AfriForum, and he compared me and Kali Kriel to Adolf Hitler and Idi Amin and all of that. And we actually had a good discussion. So maybe just something about that, and I'll get to the point about farm murders.
But before you continue, Aaron, is that discussion available somewhere if people want to listen to it?
Not yet, but it will be published in the next few days.
All right, excellent.
So it's been recorded, but it hasn't been published.
On your YouTube channel, I assume.
Yeah, I'll upload it on my YouTube channel. Yeah. So what I said at the beginning of the discussion is the point for me is not to have a debate or to try to, for the one person to destroy the other or whatever. I said to him that I have two goals with this discussion. The one is not only to talk about AfriForum, but to talk about some of the bigger picture issues in South Africa or in the world. And the other one is to try to see what are the issues on which we actually agree and what are the issues on which we disagree. And I think in that sense, it was a good discussion. It wasn't a debate. It was a more inquisitorial type discussion. But what I want to get to is, so we spoke about farm murders as well. And he then said that his criticism to AfriForum is that he agrees that farm murders is a problem, but he doesn't agree with the narrative that AfriForum is pushing, or the way in which AfriForum is pushing its agenda. So, and basically what he said was, for if we want his support in the campaign against farm murders, what we need to do is frame our concern about farm murders to be less, I'm using my own words to try to describe what he said, but basically less an identity thing and more a general crime phenomenon that affects us as South Africans, as opposed to having a cultural dimension. And to an extent, you can make that point, that it is an issue that affects us as South Africans. It affects us all. It has wider consequences. Not only can you make that point, I think you should make that point. But if you only make that point, then there's a very important and a very significant part of the phenomenon that you are ignoring. And that is that there also is a very strong identity element beneath this whole issue.
That's something that will come to the fore when we get into the statistics that you discussed yesterday.
Yes. In terms of people being targeted because of who they are. Yes, they are being targeted because they live in remote areas, and yes, poverty and unemployment plays a role, but there's also a very strong element of people being targeted based on who they are. And we see that with some of the most horrible examples, and there's unfortunately not only one, but several such examples where the attackers wrote the words "kill the Boer" on the walls of the farm. In one case, they even took the blood, I think in two cases, if I recall, they even took the blood of the victims, and they used the blood to write "kill the Boer" on the walls of the farmhouse. And you cannot...
that's so if anyone interested, you actually talk about it in your book, right? You go through a lot of these cases.
Right? Of the book, yes. So there are such examples, and if we say that when you talk about farm murders, you should not talk about the identity side of it as well, then what you are effectively saying is that there's a particular narrative that is acceptable, and you should confine your concern about this problem within the prescribed narrative. But in as far as you step outside of the prescribed narrative, regardless of what you are saying is actually a manifestation of what is happening, as far as you step out of the prescribed narrative, you should not expect support from the mainstream. And I think that's the problem with the whole issue that we have to deal with.
Yeah, so he basically told you need to frame it more in a mainstream way But isn't that the exact type of criticism you got when you appeared in Parliament in 2018 from a lot of pundits, not from within Parliament. Within Parliament, they basically told you we can't agree with anything you say. But from a lot of pundits afterwards said, "Yeah, Adam's made some good points. AfriForum put some facts on the table, but his tone was wrong. The way he approached it was wrong. The way he framed it was wrong." And don't you think this is just one big cop-out, really?
Well, the new term that people love to say, and they said it after the Parliament presentation, is tone deaf. How can you be so tone deaf? And for me, and I've said that on Twitter as well, if the term tone deaf is the new popular term used by progressive liberals who do not have a proper response to point out why they disagree with what someone is saying, other than to try to make the point that whatever that person is saying is not entirely aligned with the narrative that they are trying to promote. So when what you're saying doesn't really fit with the narrative, the response is, "Oh no, you are tone deaf because you are speaking outside of the narrative." And that's what we see. We see that Peter de Toy and Max de Pree and some of these people love the word tone deaf. And that's just a key word for there are some good things in what you are saying, but you should frame it differently because you are framing it outside of the prescribed narrative. And I don't think we should take it seriously when someone criticizes you of being tone deaf, because that's just a signal or a keyword for that person having a very strong ideological predisposition that person wants to enforce on you and wants you to subscribe to.
But it's pretty much a checkmate in their from their perspective, because if you were saying things that were not factual, things that were disinformation, they would point that out. But if you were bringing facts to the table, they can just say, "But he was tone deaf." So there's no scenario within that approach where they will ever admit that you were right. As soon as you bring undeniable facts to the table, they would just say, "But your tone was wrong in terms of presenting those facts." It's a win-win, really, in the propaganda game.
It is, and it's a way of trying to squeeze people into a particular narrative. So it's not what you said is false. It's simply that I don't like the way in which you have said it. It doesn't really fit into the narrative. So you have to say it differently. You have to be more politically correct. And sometimes what we always say at AfriForum is it's a particular focus for us to make sure that whatever we say is morally correct, that we always have the moral high ground. But then we also have to add to that having the moral high ground does not equate or is not the equivalent of being politically correct. In fact, what happens more and more is that having the moral high ground is very politically incorrect in the current system in which we are. So we should not measure ourselves by the extent to which we are politically correct. We should measure ourselves by whether we have the moral high ground in what we are saying.
And I see Adam's a very interesting comment here from the Dodgy Idealist. He says, I realize that in terms of the lies being told about AfriForum people bringing awareness to farm murders. And he further says, "I can't believe I was duped for so long. My perspective of AfriForum changed and of Ernst. I'm actually glad that I had the opportunity to change in that perspective." Well, but I'm very glad to hear that, Dodgy Idealist. And I hear that story from a lot of people, and I guess you do too, Ernst.
Yes, we do. We do get that. And I think that's part of the good news about the rise of alternative media, where one example for me to point that out is if you read I think Herman Gilumea is probably the best historian in this country, and certainly an excellent. I think he's well deserving of the praise that he receives as a historian on Afrikaner history. And sure, people can say that he says some things with which they disagree and all of that, but I haven't met someone with as much knowledge as him in terms of Afrikaner history. But if you read his autobiography, so he had an autobiography published a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, and basically it's his life story, but he tells it against the backdrop of history as it progressed during his lifetime. And
that's a very unique approach.
Yes, so it's his story, but then he talks about he heard on the radio about the walkout at the National Party and the founding of the Conservative Party. So it's a very good read. You learn a lot about history just by reading his autobiography, and then he tells his story within that. But what really struck me, if you read his story, is, and I think he's above 80 already, so he's towards the end of his career. At least he's still writing, and he's still writing excellent books. I can see his book.
This is one of his books behind me.
Yes, the Afrikaner. Yes.
Yeah.
I think his best book, by the way, is The Last Afrikaner Leaders, or in Afrikaans, Die Laaste Afrikaner Leiers. But what really struck
me here as well.
That one, yes, that one. What struck me from his book is how much influence newspaper editors had in the world, but also in this country 20, 30 years ago. Especially, let's say, after, between 1950 and you could probably say 2010, you could say, where if Piet Leer, I believe he was the editor of the Burger, if Piet Leer had a problem with you, then you had a problem. You had a very difficult time, getting your message across if the newspaper editor didn't agree with you or had a problem with you.
So they were pretty much the gatekeepers of the narrative.
Yes, and they had tremendous influence. They had influence that's almost comparable to the influence of the state president. I might be exaggerating a bit, but the point is they had much more influence. They were one of the most influential institutions in society, without a doubt. And so, for example, I think you could make that point. If you were a cabinet member, a minister in cabinet, and the media or the editor of the Beeld, for example, or the Burger, thought that you were a dishonest politician, you could know that you will have a bad reputation among the public. And so the reason why I'm pointing to this is that is this phenomenon was really broken by the rise of alternative media, where it's not news to anyone that newspapers are under a lot of threat or pressure. I remember one thing that stood out to me, the first time I realized this was probably in 2012. Facebook started in 2007, or at least I don't know when it was founded, but that's at least when people started using it sort of in bigger numbers. And I remember around 2012, there was some issue where Steve Hofmeyr was involved in a controversy. And there was an opinion piece, I believe it was in Beeld when it was published, about him. And then he said that he's going to respond. And then Steve said that at that time, he said he's not going to submit his response to the newspaper for it to be published there because he has more people on his Facebook page than the newspaper has readers. And that's the first time I really picked that up, at least in the South African context, that you can have more people following you. You can have a bigger reach on social media than if your story is published in the paper. And that was less than 10 years ago. Today, that's common practice. So yes, there is there's actually a very aggressive narrative. It's comparable to an injured buffalo in a sense that because when a buffalo is at its weakest, that's also when it's at its most dangerous. And that's unfortunately the case, not with all media, but unfortunately with some in the media who are trying to use it as a weapon to push a particular agenda. But it's becoming harder and harder for them to do this. And I think that's not largely, it's mainly as a result of the rise and the power and the influence of alternative media.
But all the from what I've seen, the attempts to regain their popularity or their audiences, pretty much in a very Shakespearean fashion, just makes their fall even faster. I mean, the only way to compete with the internet and with alternative media for them and to retain the attention of their audiences is to become more tabloid, to become more sensational, to become more clickbaity, where they have sensational headlines, but the article is not really of any substance at all. And I think that just increases the amount of people that are turning away from mainstream media. I mean, you don't have to be like a genius or a super hyper aware person to realize that there's something wrong with the mainstream media and with editors that just have such a blatant bias, but they're under this misconception that nobody can see it and that they're very objective. And I think that's the big difference that I've picked up between the alternative media and the mainstream media. The mainstream media is largely despised for the fact that they falsely, very weakly put out this facade of objectivity, and we're looking at the facts, and we're not going to bring you a narrative. We're going to tell you the news. But alternative media voices, like, for example, Jeremy Nell or Roman Kabanak or me or Ronaldo Gous, are very open about our biases in terms of, I'm not going to tell you I'm completely unbiased and objective. I'm not going to tell you I'm just going to look at the news and tell you the information without imbuing my analysis of the news with my own opinion. That's what you get with my channel, and my audience knows it very well because I repeat it very often. So, and I think that type of genuineness is what's attracting people more to the alternative media and away from the mainstream media. And I see there's a comment here that actually makes my point perfectly in terms of what I call the decentralization of information. There's no longer a monopoly hold on the mainstream narrative. And the Freighter Watchers in the comments says, I'm grateful to have met Conscious Caracal Ernst, who made me aware of the farm murders and pointed to legitimate news sources to gain information on the unbelievable horror. Well, that's the thing, is that's why one of my channel's slogans is, don't just believe what I say, research what I say. And I always put as many sources as possible in my videos on matters. And I think that's really the essence of the alternative media, is that genuineness. And I think that's really that's something for the better in terms of the decentralization of information. But enough of in terms of the media. Something that I think that's very important that we need to get to in this talk is definitely the statistics and the trends that you brought attention to yesterday with the media conference. Now, Adams, from what you've seen in regards to farm murders during the lockdown, what type of trends stood out to you, and something that you think is genuinely notable and something of that needs greater attention?
Well, the one thing, I think the most important thing that we pointed out was a graph that Ian Cameron discussed in his presentation about the phasing out of the lockdown compared to the increase in farm attacks. And you can clearly see, so there's two graphs over each other. The one is the different phases of the lockdown. It goes like this, and then it goes to the next phase, and then the next phase as it's eased out. And then on top of that, you can see the farm murders increasing, and it's like a scissor statistic. As the one goes down, the other one goes up. And Ian also made the point that what can we conclude from that? Well, firstly, as the lockdown eased out, farm attacks started escalating. It started, skyrocketing. But that does not mean that the solution is we should have a strict lockdown that we shouldn't get out of. But that actually shows, from a crime prevention perspective, which isn't my expertise, but what that does show is that farm attacks is linked to people's ability to move, and you can learn something from that in terms of your prevention strategy, which is that if you have more visibility, if it's more difficult for you to move as a criminal in rural areas, your chances of committing farm attacks decreases. And how do you make it more difficult for criminals to move? Not by having a national lockdown, but by having more police visibility, by empowering or allowing in the first place, but in the second place, empowering, if you can, communities to become more involved with their own safety. So that's one of the things we saw also is this, this limitation being placed on neighborhood watches. So if people are allowed to move around, to patrol the areas, if the police is there, is visible, the consequence is it's harder for people to move, and it's harder for them to commit these crimes. And that's one of the many reasons why farm attacks is such a major problem, is because there's a complete lack of police visibility or a complete lack of police efficiency, especially in rural areas. So we have this National Rural Safety Strategy, which if you read it, and that's often what the police would say, or people who are trying to downplay the extent of the problem, or government representatives would say, why are you complaining about farm murders? Why are you saying it must be prioritized? We have a rural safety strategy. Now, there's things to be said about the rural safety strategy. If you read it, it's not that bad. It seems like a good plan. The first problem is that, however, if you read it, if you don't know what the reality is, if you don't know what's in the news, you only read the rural safety strategy, you wouldn't even know that farm murders is a problem. There's no mention of farm attacks or farm murders in that plan. So that's the first thing, is if you really want to have an effective counter strategy, you need to identify the problem and speak to the problem. But secondly, even if that plan was as it is, despite the flaws or the shortcomings, if that plan was properly implemented or executed, it would have a major impact on farm murders. The numbers would be lower, but the plan isn't being implemented because there's talk about patrols, there's talk about vehicles being allocated to rural areas, and we've heard many of the stories, we've seen many of the cases where the vehicles that are supposed to be part of the rural safety strategy are standing in a room at Brooklyn Police Station, for example, in right. Pretoria. So the plan isn't being implemented. But I think the point, just to get back to your question, is one of the things that really stood out is the extent to which it has skyrocketed, and it's still skyrocketing. Where in the first week of July, we had about as many farm murders as we had in the whole of June.
Right, and we had 4 brutal farm murders over the weekend.
Yes, exactly. And now if you compare June to May, you would see that there were very few in May. So during the lockdown, there weren't that many. So in that sense, you can say farm murders have been decreasing on average since last year. But of course, there's a massive variable thrown into the mix, which is the coronavirus and the lockdown. But we can see it really stepping up now.
And something that I saw, I actually find it quite funny, is, and I mean, I was there, I was at the media, at the press conference, and Ian Cameron, I think he made one statement, like 1 or 2 sentences about farmers needing to arm themselves and know their way around a firearm, legally acquiring a firearm to be able to defend themselves. And a major news outlet in South Africa made that the headline in terms of AfriForum calls for farmers to take up arms. But maybe you can shed some light specifically on that sentiment that Ian, I mean, I talked to Ian Cameron just a week ago about how to defend yourself with a weapon and why it's important to have one. But maybe you can just shed some light in regards to what he meant in regards to farmers needing to arm themselves.
Yes, so maybe just a comment about that news report. Firstly, what struck me is the heading says AfriForum basically calls on farmers to arm themselves to protect themselves, and it's
in literal quotation marks.
Yes, but it's only the word protect that's in quotation marks, as if the author of the news report wasn't really convinced that farmers needed to protect themselves. Either that, or they felt that it's not really what AfriForum is trying to do. For AfriForum, it's not about protecting farmers. They have some other agenda. That's the only 2 explanations I can think of why they would put protect in quotation marks. And if you read the article, and it goes to the point we made about the media, and I don't think the author isn't, the journalist isn't mentioned, it just says reporter. I'm not sure if that person did it deliberately. I'm convinced the author of that report did it subconsciously. But if you read the news report, it's as if the person who wrote it was so hell-bent on conveying to the reader that he did not agree with what he was writing. Which is why he would say, why he or she, I don't know, would put protect in quotation marks, or they would say AfriForum claims that, and we saw that earlier with, what was the story, I think at the beginning of the lockdown, when the Citizen, it was about the minister who said that they would use race as a criteria, or when small and medium enterprises would receive government support. And then in the news report, it said that AfriForum claims that, when AfriForum says something, AfriForum is quoted as claiming that. But then when the minister says something, it's quoted as the minister has confirmed that. Now, there's a difference between claiming and confirming. Both said something. If you say the one claimed and the other one confirmed, it creates a particular it conveys a particular message. So just that on that point. But so the question was about the firearms. Yes, I think it's an important point that we had this open letter that we wrote to the president that's on our website. But I think one of the more important parts of the conference was to say that we need to take responsibility for our own safety. And one of the ways to do this is to make sure if you live on a farm, or not only if you live on a farm, it goes for people in urban areas as well. But the focus here was particularly farms and farm attacks. It's good for you to be armed, to have a firearm. But if you have a firearm, you need to know how to use it. You need to be trained in it. You need to, not only should you know how to use it, you should also be prepared to use it. So there's this question, if you do firearm training, is, or at least one of the points they emphasize is, you need to decide in advance how you are going to act in a particular situation. Don't wait until you are in that situation, and then you have to decide what your response would be, because that would mean that you would hesitate and all of that. So if you're not prepared to use a firearm, or if you don't know how to use a firearm, it's better not to have one. But if you have one and you know how to use it and you are prepared to use it within the framework of the law, that is the better situation. And we've seen that that's one of the points that we stressed and we pointed out is farm attacks are still increasing. But farm murders aren't increasing at the same rate as farm attacks. But what we also see, what is increasing, is farm attackers being killed by the victims, by the people who are being attacked, people fighting back, shooting the attackers and killing them.
Yeah, I think one of the stats was 5 farm attackers were killed in the process during the lockdown. I don't know what the time period was, but during the time that was being analyzed by
I think it was in the last 3 months or something. So we see that people are fighting back, and they are fighting back more effectively, which is one of the reasons. It's sort of bittersweet, but in a sense it's good news, because it says that at least in some way it's contributing to the solution, or people aren't waiting for the police to protect them. They aren't waiting for the government to fix the problem. They have realized that if that's your line of approach, your chances of surviving is smaller. So in a sense, in a weird way, that's good news that people are fighting back. And we can see that. And I think it's something to stress. It's something to point out that, again, it's not only for people in rural areas. I think it's good for people in South Africa. If you have the capacity and also the mental capacity to carry a firearm, and if you know how to use it within the framework of the law, and you know how to defend yourself, and you are trained in it, it's better to be armed. It's better for your safety, and it's better for the safety of those around you. And I think the point that Ian Cameron put so eloquently during the conference is, if you are able to do that, you would be able to protect your family. And if families are able to protect themselves, then if you can protect your family, then you might also be able to protect your neighbors. And if neighbors are able to protect themselves, then we find a situation where a community is able to protect itself. And what we find then is farm attacks in that entire community goes down. And it's not just a theory, it's something that happens. I mean, we can point out to such examples where there were a lot of farm attacks and people started organizing and training, driving patrols, and then farm attacks in that community.
And you see it in the statistics as well. Over the past few years, I think 2 or 3 years, the amount of farm attacks has actually increased, but the amount of farm murders has stayed relatively the same. I'm talking under correction in regards to staying the same or decreasing. But that points to the fact that farmers are much more prepared and much better organized in regards to dealing with the issue and protecting their families and their own lives.
Yes, that's exactly the case. But there's also a negative spin-off of that, and that is that in many of these cases, the attackers move. They don't stop committing the attacks. They move to a more vulnerable, less vigilant community, and they start targeting that community. So we do find that. So communities who are able to look after themselves are in a way able to protect themselves. It starts with you as an individual, but then it moves to your family, to your neighbors, and then you want to reach the point where the community is safe. And yes, then it leads to the unfortunate thing is there are always a community nearby that isn't as vigilant as yours, and that communities then tend to be targeted. So we need, not only as communities, but also as a society, we need to be more vigilant.
And seeing as we are talking about a solution, this is more of a personal solution that you as a member of a family can take, or as a farmer on a farm, is to get your legal firearm license and to know how to use it. You mentioned in your book, you dedicate an entire section to solutions, but broader solutions in regards to maybe what you want from, or what the very least you expect from the government or from broader society. Could you get a little bit into that in regards to how we can actually effectively fight this problem, but from the types of solutions that you mentioned in your book?
Yes. So you can summarize them in two strands and say it's a two-tier solution, or a double strategy. That's actually what I called it in the book, or what we call it as AfriForum. So one side of the strategy is what we've discussed now, is taking control of your own security, being more vigilant, arming yourselves legally, and being in charge of who you are and what your community is doing in terms of security. But the other side of the strategy is to put more pressure on the South African government to hold them accountable for their lack of action. And so you could call it the do-it-yourself side of the strategy, and then the political campaign side of the strategy. And by political, I mean politics in the broad sense of the word, not party politics. So in terms of what government should do, firstly, we cannot just wait for government to solve the problem.
Right.
We need to solve the problem ourselves as far as we can. But we also cannot accept it as normal if there's a problem like this in society and government isn't responding to the problem as they should. So in the open letter we sent to the president, we mentioned 10 things that we believe the government should be doing. And that includes, for a start, a recognition of the problem, the fact that there's recognition of what the true extent of the problem is, and that includes releasing statistics. Because if you recognize the problem, you would be able to release statistics on that. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is to fulfill the promise that was made in 2003 with the disbandment of the commando system, when it was said the commando system would be disbanded and it would be replaced with a different structure within the police that would fulfill those duties. And it's now, since 2003, it's 17 years down the line, and that promise hasn't been kept. So in other words, some form of a structure that is that is funded properly, and where local communities can become involved and recognized in law as being involved with that structure, where they are able to look after their own safety more efficiently. That's another thing that they should be doing. What government should also be doing is partnering with civil society, continued independent research about the phenomenon itself, but also on different potential counter strategies. Government should be, as I said, partnering with civil society. I think there's a lot of different things that government should be doing. I think one particular aspect is in terms of law, a legislative approach, which could include, for example, harsher penalties for farm murderers, a recognition of farm attacks as a hate crime, or farm murders as hate crimes, and different ways of using the law to respond to this. And we don't find any of that. One aspect of that is, for example, criminalizing the romanticizing of violence towards farmers. That's one thing that government could do. So if you go on Twitter and you romanticize about killing farmers, then you would be committing a crime and you should be prosecuted for that. There's a lot of things that government should be doing that they aren't doing. And that's part of what the letter was about.
And I see here's a question. What about AfriForum assisting police in investigation and prosecution? Is that an element of AfriForum strategy? Yeah. I think that's the question.
I think that's one of the things that government should be doing better or more efficiently is better investigation of these attacks. And there are the most horrible stories imaginable about farm attacks not being investigated properly. by the police. And in one case that I mentioned in the book as well, one of the cases that I mentioned in the book was the case of David Hall, who was murdered near Vogwel. And in that case, the crime scene there was a lot of forensic evidence on the scene, cigarette butts, cables that was used to tie up the victims. Bernadette Hall survived, David's wife. There was blankets soaked in blood and all of that. And the police came and they wanted to leave the scene with all the evidence still lying around, and they had to be called back to say, listen, look at all the forensic evidence. You need to pick this up and you need to take this to a laboratory and make this part of your case, which they then sort of reluctantly did. And a few weeks later, eventually the perpetrators were caught. And Bernadette, who was there, who saw that, she was tied up by these attackers, she went to an identification parade and she identified them. She said, I saw them. These are the people who murdered my husband. And what happened then when the matter came to court, all of that forensic evidence just disappeared. It wasn't brought to the court. It didn't exist for all practical purposes. And what happened then is they were charged with murder, but they were found not guilty because there wasn't evidence to prove them guilty. And then we have this double jeopardy principle, which means you can't trial someone twice for the same crime. So if you are found to be not guilty, you are not guilty. You can't go back and say, well, actually, we forgot to bring the evidence, so we're going to take you back to court. So those people have been found not guilty, despite them having been identified by the victim. They are walking around in the area. Bernadette spoke about seeing them in the area, in the community sometimes when she drives around. And that's a very horrible example of police negligence. And yes, it does happen where AfriForum branches or AfriForum security structures are very much involved with the investigation, assisting the police, making sure that they do the statements properly. We've had examples of that, of police just not being properly trained in taking witness statements. And then they would take different statements at different times and it would be contradictory because of the way in which the police officer framed it. And then it would be sort of used against the victim. I mean, there are so many problems with that, with the way in which the police are responding to these attacks. And yes, it is something that AfriForum is involved with in assisting communities in that way.
And maybe just something to end off this conversation on. AfriForum launched the World Must Know campaign earlier this year. You and Monique Tauter went to the US to specifically talk about not only expropriation without compensation, but farm murders also featured very prominently. But from what you've observed, I mean, you talk to a lot of Americans and to a lot of people internationally in general, and you get a lot of feedback from people internationally and you monitor social media. But from what you've seen, is the world taking notice? Is the world becoming more aware of the problem from what you've seen?
Yes, I would say the world is now more aware of the problem than they have ever been, but they aren't sufficiently aware of the problem. It's not strange to go to the US or to some country in Europe and meet someone there. And if you have a conversation with them, they would say something like, oh, they've heard about the farm attacks in South Africa. If they hear you're from South Africa, it's not strange for people to meet people who say, oh, they've heard about this. Obviously, they would have a lot of questions and they wouldn't really understand the phenomenon. Sometimes you find people saying, they've heard about this, but they've also heard people saying that it's a conspiracy, it's not true. And we've seen that with government representatives if we compare, I've said this before, I mean, I've been to the US in particular almost every year now since 2012 to meet people and to sort of broaden our network and or at least in some cases to attend conferences at the United Nations in New York. And you can see there's a difference where in the past you had to talk to people to explain to them that a problem exists. It's not really the problem, the challenge anymore. It's not about explaining to people that there is the problem of farm murders. It's about explaining to them what the extent of the problem is. So in that sense, I think we've made a lot of progress. And I think that's part of the reason why, I mean, we've heard people talk about this. We saw Donald Trump tweet about farm murders. heard comments by various people. We saw that motion being adopted by the Parliament in Australia, motions in New Zealand. We've heard the same thing, or in the Netherlands as well. We hear people talking about this more and more, but there's a massive, you could call it a disinformation campaign if you want. People actively trying to portray this as something that people should not respond to. And again, it goes to the point you made earlier about the Overton window or the narrative, where I don't see people going around saying violence against women is not a problem. Stop talking about violence against women. You would find people being annoyed by it, or you would find people, saying that they believe it's an exaggeration or something like that.
Right.
The Black Lives Matter and all of that. You would find people.
If you were to say that there's a woman genocide going on in South Africa, I think you would get some ridicule.
Well, yes, but I think people are talking about femicide. The state president, the state president talked about femicide. He used the term femicide in his speech. But you won't get the same ridicule if you say women are being there's a genocide of women in South Africa, as opposed to there's a genocide of farmers. The president said there's a femicide, but it's not the backlash to him saying there's a femicide, as they would do to AfriForum saying there's a white genocide or something about that.
Or on the contrary, where, for example, imagine the president going to an international forum and saying there's no murdering or beating of women in South Africa.
Yeah,
I mean, it's equally bizarre. It's equally untrue, but in almost in the weirdest way, you didn't even get silence from the media in the case when the president, I think in 2019, he said 18. He said that there's no murdering of farmers in South Africa, and the media didn't just stay silent on it and ignore it. They went even further. They wrote opinion pieces on, and I think the literal title of the opinion piece that Peter Tuwe from News 24 wrote was "What the President Really Meant with his There Are No Farm Murders" comment."
They rushed to defense, yes.
Yeah, I mean, why does the ANC even need a PR team if you've got a professional team like that that'll just, without you even asking, that'll rush to your aid? And I think more and more people are realizing this, that it's just so blatant, it's so out in the open, and the double I mean, if a lot of these people that speak out against bringing awareness to farm murders didn't have double standards, they wouldn't have any standards at all.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And but I think the good news is that, again, the rise of alternative media, and it's not so much getting the message out is not entirely dependent on getting the endorsement of the newspaper, the influential newspaper editors that I spoke of earlier. You can get your message across in other ways. It's very good to get the message across through the mainstream, in the mainstream media. What we always say at AfriForum is there's one major advantage and one major disadvantage of the mainstream media, of getting publicity in the mainstream media, and it's inverted when it comes to alternative media. So the major advantage of receiving publicity in the mainstream media is it's regarded as credible, and the reason why it's regarded as credible is because there's a middleman, there's an editor your news has to go through the filter, and someone has to say, yes, this is really news for us to publish it, regardless of whether you agree with the editor or not. If you have to get through the filter to reach the newspaper. So in that sense, it means if you are able to reach the newspaper, it at least conveys to people that you are credible in some way. Whether that's an illusion or not, that's probably another issue. But the major disadvantage is you don't control the narrative. So typically the example we spoke of, that the journalist writing about farm murders, but trying so hard to point out to the reader that he doesn't agree with what he's writing. So that, and then the inverse goes for alternative media, is the major disadvantage is that it is regarded as less credible because anyone can do it. But the major advantage is that you have more control over the narrative, over the message that you get across. You don't have to go through so many filters. So the point that I'm trying to make is you need to use both. You need to use alternative media, but you also need to use the mainstream media. And that's what we are trying to do as AfriForum. and I think it becomes, sometimes it's hard to use alternative media because often you don't reach as many people, especially if it's a new outlet, and it's hard to use the mainstream media because often you have this battle with the ideological predispositions of the editor who is trying to push a particular narrative. But you need to use both if you want to have an effective communication strategy.
Right. And I see, Ernst, this is off topic, but I see there's a comment here saying, "Good job, Ernst Roets. Your documentaries on China in South Africa are second to none." So if you guys are interested, I mean, this is completely off topic, but if you're interested in those videos, Ernst Roets on his YouTube channel has a whole series on AfriForum's report on China and Africa. So you can just type in after this show on YouTube, Ernst Roets channel, and you'll find his YouTube channel, and all episode 1 to 7 on China and Africa will be there. It's fascinating stuff. And there's another comment here that I just wanted to address. Where is it now? Oh, here it is. Guy got in contact with this week, actually. Gatskop Software is creating a Boer War game for the PC, which I think is absolutely amazing, and trying to make it as historically accurate as possible. Thank you very much. If you guys if that in any way interests you, please go check out Gatskop Software on YouTube. They have a channel. Go check out what they're doing. It's just one guy, and he's creating a game about the Boer War all on his own. And I really think he deserves an audience to watch him do it. So best of luck to you. And I see he's in the chat here, so I just wanted to give him a little shout out. But John, Adams, we've reached the end of the show, and maybe just to end things off, do you have any final thoughts in regards to this issue? I mean, if we have to be frank, the issue of farm murders is not going to be solved just within a year or instantly. It's something that's going to be a hard battle. It's going to be with us for many years to come, but we can do our best to mitigate it, to give people the type of awareness and preparedness to be able to deal with it. But what are your final thoughts in regards to this issue that it has been plaguing South Africa for decades, and maybe just your thoughts for the future?
Well, maybe a general comment. I think the one thing that stands out for me in terms of what I've learned, maybe from a strategic perspective, from this whole campaign about farm attacks and farm murders, because I've been involved with AfriForum Youth since 2008, before that Solidarity Youth, and that was already when farm murders, it became a problem in, as we know, in the 90s, but it sort of spiked around the year 2000. And anyway, so I've been involved for quite some time, and the most important thing that I've learned, having spoken about this a lot and having done a lot of interviews and having, been confronted or attacked about this, is a lesson that is not only applicable to the topic of farm murders, but that is applicable probably to life in general, but more particularly to, you can call it communication strategy in general. And that is that it is better to be more conservative in your arguments and to have your arguments be more solid and waterproof, or bulletproof rather, than to try to stretch the point that you are trying to make with the belief that what you are saying is true, but not being able to prove it. It's better to be more conservative, to make a more conservative point, and then you can reach the same conclusion and stress that, as opposed to, for example, using the worst possible statistics that you can find to strengthen your case. And then when you are confronted about those statistics and asked to prove it, you sort of suddenly find yourself in troubled waters. And what I've seen, especially with the issue about farm murders, is, and that's typically a tactic that is being used against the campaign against farm murders, is that there's this idea that if you can point to one flaw in a person's argument, it means that the entire argument should not be taken seriously. So there's 100 things you say about farm murders, and then one of the things that you say that is inaccurate, for example, is you make a calculation about the per 100,000 ratio. What's the ratio at which farmers are being murdered? And if you, for example, make that a mistake with that calculation, the conclusion is because you made that mistake, which is 1 out of 100 things you said, it means every single thing that you said should be dismissed as not credible. So I think the lesson here is is, especially if you are in a position where you get tested publicly, or if you want to engage in debates with people who disagree with you, it's much better to be conservative in the numbers that you use, knowing that, I mean, I know I can say that without a doubt. I know for a fact the actual number of farm attacks and farm murders are higher, probably much higher than the numbers that we use. But the reason why we use the numbers that we use is because we can prove them. We have the names. We have the names of the people who have been attacked and murdered, and we speak about those people. We don't speak about the names that we don't have. And if you do that, your argument is much more bulletproof. And one way to prove it, maybe, if I think to make a comment about the book, because that was pretty much the approach I took with the book. Is I remember, I mean, you mentioned, I think we both mentioned Peter de Toy, who obviously has this very obvious political agenda. I remember when the book came out, he said that, I think he made a tweet, or a few weeks after or a few months after, someone said, "Why haven't you said anything about the book? Why haven't you reviewed the book?" And then he said, "No, well, they plan on getting some experts to review the book." And obviously it was clear what he meant by that is they believe that there are many factual errors in the book, and they're going to get some experts to point out why the book shouldn't be believed. And they never published their expert review of the book. And maybe I'm reading too much into that, but I think it's hard if someone points out to something that's written in the book about farm murders that's inaccurate, I'll fix it. I'll change the statistics, and we'll make an updated version, or we'll point out, we'll say, yes, okay, well, this was wrong. But so far, literally no one has done that. I've heard people disagreeing with the conclusions. I haven't heard a single person arguing with the content of the book, saying that the content of the book is wrong. You are saying stuff that isn't true. And the book is written more conservatively. I'm not trying to stretch the truth as much as I can. I'm trying to present the truth as accurately as I can. And surely there will be mistakes, as is the case with any book. But that's so our approach should be to try to fix that, other than instead of just trying to pretend that it isn't there.
And for anyone that's interested, this is Ernst Roets' book, Kill the Boer. It is available on Amazon, so you can go check it out there. And if you are really interested in the topic, I would highly recommend you order it for yourself and read it. But Ernst, maybe on a lighter note, just to end off, I see there's a very critical question here in the chat, and that comes from Red Sky Mountaintop, who says, before you go, Ernst, ask Ernst if he's still rocking his guitar. He should tweet more clips. I love it.
Thank you. Yes, I don't play as much guitar as I would like to. I was a very, very fanatical guitar player in high school and during my student years, where I would play for hours on every day. I don't play as much now. I play maybe once or twice a week. But yes, I do still play. And I'm hoping to record some more stuff in the coming weeks, and maybe I'll upload some videos, some more videos on social media.
All right, excellent. Well, Ernst Roets, thank you very much for joining me. It was a very enlightening, interesting conversation. And thank you very much for everyone that tuned in and that watched and that shared my videos and that left a like and always that are taking part in the chat. It's always very interesting to see your thoughts, your questions. I mean, your questions make the show better. It really adds more depth. And then afterwards as well, if you're not watching live, do remember to leave a comment. If you have a question or just a general comment or point you want to make, I read all of them. I try to respond to as many as possible. And let's get the conversation going. That's the magic of alternative media. But yeah, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the night. And Ernst, I hope you also have a very great evening, and we'll chat again real soon.
Thank you very much. We'll speak again.
All right. Cheers, guys. Have a good one. Walk well.